Okay. All right. So thank you all for being here. Super exciting. I was sharing with a couple of people that we had maybe 11 signups at the beginning of the week, and now we had 36. So it's incredible. Thank you all for
Oh,
spreading the word, and really excited to have this conversation and this presentation by Dr. Shantel Meek. So I'm going to give her a quick intro and then we'll get going. Dr. Shantel Meek, she's a professor of practice and the founding executive director of the Children Equity Project. During her time in the Obama administration, she advised senior officials at HHS and the White House on a wide array of policy issues, including Head Start, childcare, public pre-K expansion, and promoting equity across the early care and education system. Today, she's going to speak on how quality, affordable, and accessible childcare helps build a quality workforce and improves employee retention. So without further ado, Chantelle, it's all you. And if there's anything you need to share on the screen, you have that access.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. Happy to be here with you all. Thanks for having me. I'm gonna share my slides if that's okay. To get us started. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yes.
And it's a small group, so feel free to jump in, interrupt me, ask me to stop. I get real excited about these things, and sometimes I talk fast and I keep going. So I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen. So just
I'll monitor the chat for you.
Okay, perfect. Well, buenas tardes, I guess. It's afternoon now. Again, so excited to be here with you. I love Tucson. I feel like it's close enough to home. I was born in Tucson, but raised in Nogales. And then moved to Phoenix and went to school at ASU. As Frank mentioned, I took a 10-year stint in DC where I worked for the Obama administration doing early childhood policy at the federal level. And then after having 2 babies, I came back because I was too far away from home to raise those 2 little babies by myself. So came back to Phoenix and started the Children's Equity Project at ASU. And I think we just turned 6 in the spring. So we've been around for about 6 years now. We are a policy center that's housed under the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, but we really operate as a network with universities and folks across the country to really focus on closing opportunity gaps that exist in all the systems that serve kids and families. So we have a really big focus on childcare and early learning, and we'll talk about why. But we also do stuff in K-12, in immigration, in child welfare, in other family services, because a lot of these issues that we'll see are kind of mirrored across the many different places. We do research, obviously, being at an academic institution, but we also really the heart of our work is policy and doing research that informs policy and doing policy, working with policy folks across all levels, from the federal level to the state level to the local level and beyond. We'll drop the link of to our website in the chat, so where you guys can get the report that I'm going to be talking about today, but lots of other resources that we've published on basically all of the different topics I'm going to talk about today, where you guys can dig deeper at any point. So I'm going to start here. Usually I'm talking to early childhood people or education folks. I don't know everybody in the room, but from the business community, I don't know that there's that same foundation. So I wanted to start at the brain science and really talk about why we focus on the early years, just to get on that same page before we jump in to what's going on in Arizona and what's not going on in Arizona. So we have lots of research over decades and decades now that have found that the early years of development, prenatal through, the first year being really important, the first 3 being super important, the first 5, really being a critical period that kind of sets the foundation for the rest of the life course, right? This chart here, you'll note, was published by Harvard, the Center for the Developing Child. And they kind of chart, you'll see at the bottom time, right? Months or years in a child's life. And then kind of when different processes in the brain peak. And what you'll notice, look at that first year. Most of the peaks are happening in that first year. The higher cognitive functioning goes out through the early childhood space. But so much of brain development, in fact, 90% of the brain is formed to its adult size by the time a kid turns 5, right? And when we think about our public systems and our public funding, right, we actually don't begin treating education as a public good until a kid turns 5 and enters kindergarten, right? Where we have universal access to public education. Before that, families are largely on their own. And I'm going to describe kind of the state of the landscape in Arizona in just a minute. But I think the takeaways here are brain development starts before kids are born and really ramps up during those first few years of life. There's this sensitive period, right, where it could be really good because the brain is sensitive to positive inputs, positive experiences, positive adult-child interactions, healthy relationships, all of those things the brain is like soaking up and will use as the foundation for the future. It can be really bad if you don't have those positive experiences, right? If you have, if there is high poverty, if there isn't high quality childcare, if there's poor quality childcare, if there is toxic, levels of stress, if there is a whole number of other adverse challenges that many, many families in our community face, that can be especially bad because, again, the brain is at a really sensitive period where the good and the bad really impact it for the long term. And so with that foundation, there's a lot of research that finds that high quality early years, so early childhood experiences, are associated with like every outcome you can imagine. I can throw out so many studies that have looked at kids 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years after they've attended high quality early childhood programs. And they do better in school. They are more likely to graduate from high school. They earn more money once they graduate high school. They're more likely to go on to post-secondary education. There are associations with a number of health outcomes, and the list kind of goes on and on. But those outcomes are dependent on the quality of the experiences kids get, right? And so the bad news is that children in this country, children in this state, children in this community have different access to those positive experiences. And they have different outcomes resulting from that childcare, early learning, early experiences. And we know that those opportunities break down across lots of different factors, right? By zip code, by the language kids speak at home, by their race, by their ethnicity, by their immigration status, by fill in the blank, right? There are all of these societal pieces and societal barriers that get in the way of children having access to these early experiences that really set the foundation for brain development and positive outcomes over the life course. So we know that our systems are not fair, and this is even for babies. And I'll talk about some of that in more detail in a bit. We don't have equal access to learning opportunities. Once kids are in childcare or early learning settings, their experiences are not universally the same, right? So the challenge for us is really how do we build early education systems that are fair and afford opportunity for all, right? And really create that future workforce, the current workforce, right? Because if you're a parent, I can tell you again, I have 2 little kids. If I'm uncomfortable where my kid is and I'm worried if they're safe and I'm worried if they're learning, or if I think they're just kind of being, sat there and not cared for in the way that I would be caring for them, I'm not going to be that productive at work. I'm going to be distracted. I'm going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to be checking my phone all the time to make sure, right? And it's that peace of mind for parents and the workers of today. It's not just we need a place to put the kid. We need a place where the kid is going to be cared for and loved and taught and help to develop, right, in the best way that they deserve, and that we all deserve. And it's about these kids in the future, right? It benefits no one for us to be creating this shaky foundation for young children who are going to grow up and be in our schools and then be in our colleges and universities or not, right? And be in our communities and be in our businesses. So a couple years ago, we partnered with some folks at the state level to do this exhaustive review of what is the state of early learning in the state of Arizona, including childcare. What does it look like? Who has access? What does the data say? Who is governing this? What does the funding look like? We kind of looked at a number of different questions across the state with respect to early learning. And we took a particular attention to really trying to understand access experiences and outcomes of all kids, yes, but kids who have been historically marginalized. Children who speak languages other than English, right? Children from immigrant families, Latinos, Black children, Indigenous children, children with disabilities, children who face other sorts of barriers, right? Within all of these systems. So just as a snapshot, to take a look at who are the young children in the state of Arizona. The two bars on the left is Arizona. The two bars on the right is just the US population as a comparison point. And we looked at race and ethnicity, and then we looked at poverty level and what that looked like, right? Obviously, we have different figures here, so you'll see different trends. For example, Arizona has a lot more Latinos, right? In our state than the national average. We also have Latinos facing poverty at higher rates, right, in the state. So you'll see a few different trends like that as we go, and I think it's just an important landscape to keep in mind as we think about what we found. So there's so many acronyms in the state government and all the programs, so I was just gonna do a little like baseline setting of the different programs that exist, and then we'll talk about kind of how they interact and don't across the system. So the first one we have is Head Start and Early Head Start. For folks who might not be familiar, Head Start is a federal program that was started as part of the War on Poverty back in the 60s. And it is a federal to local program. That means the state really doesn't have a role necessarily. The feds send money to grantees at the local level, which could be a city, it could be a county, it could be a community action agency, it could be a school district. So there's a number of different types of Head Start grantees. And what this program is it's different from a lot of the others because it was originally designed as an anti-poverty program. So it folds in health supports for kids and families, supports for families. So if you need to go to the DMV to get your license, like we figure out how to do that. If you need to take GED classes to get that GED, we figure out how to help you to do that. If you need to access a food pantry, because that's a concern, right? We figure out how to do that. And so Head Start provides a little bit more comprehensive and holistic supports, in addition to that childcare and early learning that is the core of the program. Then we have the Department of Economic Security's Child Care Assistance Program. This program is also largely federally funded, but instead of going straight to the locals, it goes to the state. So the federal government sends the money to the state, and then the state figures out how to spend that money to expand access to childcare for working families. The vast majority of the money goes out via a subsidy. So families get like a voucher type thing. They then have to go find care with a provider who is contracted with the state. They provide that care, then the state reimburses the childcare provider for providing those services. So this childcare assistant is for kids birth to 13. And it's really just for that, right? It doesn't have the comprehensive stuff that Head Start has. The quality is kind of all over the map of those providers. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then you have Quality First. So Arizona has an organization called First Things First, which many of you may be familiar with, that is funded by tobacco tax money and serves a number of different purposes, but really provides a lot of training and support to the early childhood system and early educators across the country. There are regional councils that decide how to spend money from First Things First. One of the things they do, they also provide scholarships. Everybody uses a different term, subsidies, scholarships. They provide scholarships for kids in the state as well, birth to 5, to access early learning opportunities. The next one, I'll spend a really short amount of time. It's the high quality early learning grants. These are federally funded, short-term, pretty temporary money mostly from the federal government to expand access to preschool, but again, short-term and not widely scaled or used. And then the last one I'll mention is our services for kids with disabilities. So there's a federal civil rights law that protects the educational rights of kids with disabilities, birth through their entire childhood. And the feds send money to the state level again to then provide, which then goes to the districts, school districts primarily, to provide early intervention, parent support, classroom supports to kids with disabilities. So that's kind of the landscape. Stop me if you guys have questions, but now I'm gonna talk about how these pieces all break down and fit together. All right. So what we found in doing this big landscape analysis is that probably not shocking if you've seen where Arizona ranks in state education rankings, that Arizona has lacked sustained public investment in early childhood, early care and education is what that stands for, over the past several decades. At the same time as we've lacked public investment, other states have really increased their investments. And so again, like the year 2000, early 2000s, moving in that period, the brain science really was kind of undeniable. There were a number of economists who were looking at return on investment for early childhood and finding a 7-to-1 return. There were all this kind of mounting evidence from a neurological perspective, from a economic perspective, making the case why early learning really matters. And so we saw a number of states increase investments here, and not in Arizona, right? And so that has been a challenge, right? We also know that there's no single system for early learning in Arizona. As I just mentioned, there's a bunch of programs. None of them are fully funded. The standards are often misaligned, and the levels of quality are totally different across the different types of programs. And of course, the result of that, right, is kids have different experiences depending on which door they come through, right? Parents are paying more than they can afford to pay, right? Because there isn't enough public funding, right? Childcare is expensive, and I'll just say this, as to put it out there. Early learning and childcare is more expensive than, say, a K-12 slot because of ratios. So whereas in K-12, you can have a teacher with 20 kids, 25 kids, you can't have one teacher for 25 babies, right? Because it's just unsafe and not what we could do. So as the younger you go in children, the more staff you need, because to have safe ratios between adults and kids. And so the biggest cost factor, what makes it so expensive, is really the number of adults you need to have to take care of children well, right? And safely and in a caring way. Which is why, right, childcare really costs more than parents can afford to pay. And so in lots of states, that's where you see, well, in the federal government and then in states, that's where you see the public sector coming in to subsidize some of those costs because early childhood and young children in this period of development kind of should be seen as a public good, right? What we also found in Arizona, which is not unique to Arizona, but is equally challenging, is the landscape for kids, again, who have been historically marginalized. We saw, and I'll go over some of these themes in a minute, we are doing really poorly with kids with disabilities. We are doing really poorly with our bilingual kids who speak Spanish or speak other indigenous languages in the state and are learning English at the same time. We're doing poorly with children of color. We're doing not so great also with kids in rural communities in rural parts of the state. So the first piece we looked at was really thinking about access, right? Who just gets in the door in the first place? What are the supports that families have access to? What we found is that childcare for infants and toddlers is more expensive than in-state tuition for university in Arizona, right? That should be shocking in itself. Arizona is not the only state where this is the case. But again, when you don't have that public funding to help subsidize, for families, then it really becomes unaffordable for folks. When you also think back, right, to like when families are having babies, right, they're generally younger people. They're generally earlier in their careers or their jobs. It's probably the period of time when you're making and earning the least amount of money, right? Having babies is expensive beyond childcare. You have the diapers, you have everything else to worry about. And then layering childcare on top of that, right? It's really exacerbating all of these stressors at the same time at a point when, again, brain development is telling us that it's the most important time to have a responsive parent, to have a responsive caregiver, to have time and attention from your families and from educators. And we're really kind of putting so much on families without adequate support. So what we found is that those Quality First scholarships that I mentioned, they serve roughly 1% of kids birth to 5 in the state. The Arizona child care subsidies I mentioned serve roughly 4.2% of all kids birth to 5, 30% of eligible kids. When we think about Head Start, which is the program, you have to be making very, very low incomes to be eligible for Head Start, right? But only 20% of our kids in poverty in Arizona have access to Head Start, which means 80% don't have access. When we think of public pre-K, Arizona ranks 44th out of 45 programs in state pre-K for 4-year-olds. So the picture that emerges here is we have like lots of different programs, all different kinds of quality. Each of them are serving like a little tiny piece of the puzzle. They're not really coordinated with each other. So beyond the fact that we don't have adequate funding, adequate coverage and access, we have this lack of coordination and efficiencies that is not helping anything, right? And is in fact probably taking up resources. So we looked at, one of the things we looked at, we wanted to look historically again, we went all the way back to 2000. And for that Arizona Child Care Subsidy Program, remember I mentioned families get this voucher, providers, and then they have to go get care at a provider who's contracted with the state to get reimbursed. Well, this is the number of providers who have been contracted with the state to provide that childcare for families, right? And what you'll notice is it's basically a cliff that went from it looks like 7,000 at its peak down to, less than 3,000, 2,000 something, right? In 2020. And so when we think about that, like, where do families go, right? And if there are fewer and fewer and fewer providers contracted with the state to support those families with higher needs, that probably means those kids are being concentrated and segregated, right, in fewer and fewer settings. Now, I mentioned the reimbursement, right, of providers. And so when you're providing care to a child who is eligible and has the child care subsidy, you get reimbursed. Now, reimbursement rates are a big policy issue within this space because states are required to conduct a market rate survey every few years to see how much providers are charging, and they're required, or the guidance is they should be providing subsidy that covers about 75% of the market rate is best practice. Well, if you look at this pattern, Arizona used to give reimbursement rates based on different districts, which is basically different regions. They don't do that anymore. But if you look again from before 2005 all the way to I think that was in 2019, the line is basically flat, right? So for over a decade, the reimbursement rate providers were getting from the state was flat, right? And I think we can all attest to the costs don't stay flat for 10 years, right? Cost of living increases, we have inflation, we have all sorts of things. This is your area, not mine, but to have a flat line probably helps describe this, right? Now in 2019, the feds increased funding for childcare. You'll see that first sharp increase. That's where it came from. And then in 2020, obviously, we got the pandemic relief money, and childcare got a good amount of that and invested some of that on reimbursement rates for providers. So that was access. Then we looked at quality, right? What's the actual quality of what kids are getting? We know, again, all of those really great and exciting outcomes I mentioned entirely depend on quality. You don't get them just for having access to pre-K or just for having access to childcare, right? It's really access to what? And the quality really varies across the state. So Arizona, for example, there is an annual review of pre-K quality that is published by the National Institute of Early Education Research. And they look at 10 indicators of quality, things like teacher credentials and the training that teachers get and the class sizes that kids have, and if the curriculum is based on research and, things like that. And this pie chart on the right kind of shows you where states are. So just under half of the states meet 8 or more, right? Another 14% meet 7, and you'll see it kind of go down. Only 11.3% of states meet 3 or fewer of the 10 quality benchmarks, and Arizona is one of those states. We also know that state spending on pre-K per child is about half of the national average. So obviously we see a correlation there, right? If you're spending half of the national average, you can't meet 10 benchmarks of quality, right? They're barely meeting 3. The other piece to think about is childcare licensing. We usually call that the quality floor, right? That's kind of the foundation, the basic health and safety to even open your doors, right? You have to be licensed by the state. These are things like background checks, fingerprint checks, the integrity of the building, right? Like making sure you have a sink, to making sure there's hand washing, things like that, right? What we know from licensing is that, again, our floor for quality is way too low and is not aligned with best practice or what most other states are doing. So if we look at a couple examples of that, this is ratios. So again, how many adults per children, right? I always ask this question when I'm giving this presentation, of how many folks in the room are parents, right? How many folks in the room are grandparents, or how many folks in the room have worked with a young child, right? Imagine back when your kid or your grandkid or a kid you worked with, imagine back when they were 2, right? And how much attention they required, right? How many questions they were asking. It's all that why, right? That language explosion. Why is this and why is that? And their little brains are just, we saw that chart of brain development, it's like peaking, right? Now imagine having 8 2-year-olds to have to care for, right? Imagine when we're thinking of babies, right? Who needs their diapers changed, who need to be fed on a regular schedule, who need that adult interaction, who are already developing their brains and need to hear the language. Imagine having 5 of them, right? That you're in charge of caring for 10 hours. And you just like physically can't give the attention you need to give to result in that optimal brain development, to result in those positive outcomes. You just physically can't when there's too many kids and there's too few adults. And so here in Arizona, we see we're at the very bottom. There are a number of national recommendations for ratios for different ages, right? So the American Academy of Pediatrics, you'll see, recommends for babies, really little babies under 12 months is 2 to 1. For, after they turn 1 up to 35 months, 3 to 1, and then going to preschool, 7 or 8 to 1, right? Being the appropriate ones. We have the National Association of the Education for Young Children. They have their own sets of ratios, a little bit higher, but around the same. We have Head Start, the federal program I mentioned, they have their own ratios. And you'll note that we are lower, right? Then we're doing worse than any of those national standards. The other pieces in licensing that are problematic, right, is that licensing is supposed to be about health and safety, right? It's supposed to be about those basic pieces to ensure that you can open your doors and serve children. But there's a number of gaps in what we're looking for. So, for example, we don't check the water in childcare programs to ensure that there is no lead, right? If folks know anything about lead poisoning, it is especially extremely harmful in the youngest children, right? Especially because their little brains are the brains and all of their organs, right, are just developing. They're just growing, they're smaller, and so they're impacted more. And basically everywhere that there is a water sample taken, right, at a larger scale, for example, California recently passed a bill to check for water, check water toxicity in childcare programs, and 1 out of 5 programs came back with unacceptable levels of lead. Similarly, the General Government Accountability Office has looked at lead and has taken water samples, and the bottom line is every time we look, there's dirty water that comes back in a proportion of programs, right? And to think that we may be putting that water in babies' bottles and we're not taking that into account when we're licensing a program, right, is really concerning. Water safety isn't in there. We have a lot of family childcare homes that are providing childcare in homes. We know that drowning is a leading cause of death for young children in Arizona. We don't think about indoor or outdoor air quality, again, with those little lungs and that higher risk for asthma and other things like that associated with those pieces. And we don't really think about kids with disabilities at all in the licensing system. And so more pitfalls there. So moving to kids with disabilities in the state of Arizona, just a few facts that we found, a few data points, right? So of the children who are receiving this Arizona child care subsidy support, fewer than 1% of them are kids with disabilities. But kids with disabilities make up way more than less than 1% of the kids in the population, right? So what is happening there with families, and why aren't they getting access? And you think about families of kids with disabilities and the increased needs that they have, right, for childcare and support. We also know that training required for early educators on supporting kids with disabilities is basically non-existent. It is optional to get coaching, right, on how to serve a child with a disability. So imagine you're the parent, maybe some of you are parents of kids with disabilities, and going to a childcare program or being faced with a childcare system where training to support your child is just optional. And if they choose not to, they choose not to. And if they choose to, then great, then you get that one, right? But think about the options and how narrowed the options are then for families of kids with disabilities. We also see that toileting policies are often used as justification to deny kids with disabilities entry into a program. You need to be potty trained to come in the 3-year-old classroom. So sorry, you can't come in, right? Or you have to stay in the baby classroom even though you're 4 and have a disability, right? When there are clear, not complicated, not expensive ways to address these pieces, right? This is kind of just a matter of neglect and exclusion for these kids. Now, there's lots of research that shows that kids with disabilities who receive their services with their peers without disabilities have improved learning outcomes and social outcomes. Kids without disabilities who have peers in their classrooms with disabilities also have see benefits in social, emotional acceptance, empathy, belonging, a whole number of pieces where you want your kids to have exposure and access to kids from all different walks of life. Well, what we find in Arizona nationally, fewer than half of preschoolers with disabilities are actually in inclusive settings. In Arizona, we do way worse than that. Only 27% of our preschoolers with disabilities have access to learning settings alongside their peers. And these are kids across the range. Like this could be a kid with a slight language delay, right? That maybe started talking a little bit later than their peers, who is unnecessarily segregated and can't go to whatever early learning program their parent wants them to go to, or to whatever early learning program is most convenient to their work or their home, right? They have to go to this segregated place specifically for kids with disabilities and drop off your kid there, right? When you think about, I had a family member with 2 little kids with disabilities, and I remember when she got preschool services, right? They told her, okay, if you want services, you have to go here to this school and this program, and this is where kids with disabilities get services, right? He had a language delay, he had a little bit of motor delay. So she went and she would take him, but she was like, I'm really confused. Like, they're making me go here so he can learn how to talk, but like none of the kids know how to talk. So I feel like it's not really helpful. It's counterintuitive. Like he gets more out of being with his cousins, right? And he learns more and like they engage more. And it makes no sense. So it makes no sense for parents. It makes no sense for kids, and it makes no sense for research, you know, that we've already found that that's not the best way. So there's that. So the next piece is really thinking about kids who are learning English alongside another language, our bilingual kids in the state of Arizona. We know that, you know, we often in the field, we call them dual language learners. We call them lots of different things, but it's basically kids who are from homes where they speak a language other than English, or in addition to English, a bilingual home. And because they're so young, they're learning whatever that home language is, and they're being exposed to English at the same time, right? So we know that this group of kids across the country, right, are really diverse. They live in every part of the US. There are various different races, various different immigration generations, right? Lots of countries of origin and languages, income, you know, really high income, really low income, and everything in between, parent education. They're diverse. In Arizona, we have 75,000 what we call English learners. And English learners is a term you use once the kid gets to kindergarten and they take an English proficiency exam and they're deemed to not be proficient, then they get special services. So there's 75,000 of those kiddos in our schools, and 85% of them are Latinos. Of young children, these are kids before you get to the school system, almost half of young children in the state are speaking a language other than English, or in addition to English at home. 70% of those are speaking Spanish, right? Not surprisingly in our state. An overwhelming majority of these kids here and across the US are US citizens. So before we jump into like the policies around how we best support these kiddos, I always like to start with getting like a really clear foundation on bilingualism and why it matters and why it's really good. For this topic in particular, we're kind of spoiled with research because it's like pick the thing you care about and there is an outcome related to being bilingual, right? There are cultural benefits, there are cognitive benefits, academic, health, earnings, higher ed, social, there's kind of across the board. There's been research done across all these different fields that have looked at the benefits of being bilingual and what that does across these places. So I'm going to dig into a couple of those just to kind of set that foundation for why this matters, right? Going back to brain development, but this time we're talking about brain development in the context of bilingualism. So we know that there are lots of brain scientists who have been studying this issue, and they found that infants are really born with the capacity to learn an unlimited number of languages. As long as you're getting high quality exposure to that language, you are able to learn it, right? Neuroscientists have documented advantages in bilingual children as early as 7 months in problem solving, executive functioning, attention shifting, perspective taking, self-regulation. See this transparent box on the slide? I wish I had this video to show you, but researchers out of the University of Washington did this study where they had little kids, so they were probably about 18 months old. And they had this transparent box that had an opening on one side. And they put a toy inside this transparent box. And they had monolingual English-speaking kids, and then they had bilingual kids who were being exposed to more than one language. And they put the box in front of the kids, and they're like, okay, you know, get the toy out. So the kids would like figure out and find the side of the box that had the opening and take the toy out. And they did it like 10 times, right? They did it a bunch of times. And then the researchers like turned the box around so that the opening was on the opposite side. What they found was that bilingual kids tried it once, but then right away started figuring out, okay, that didn't work. So let me hurry up and like find the other way and try to problem solve here, and found the other opening significantly faster than the monolingual kids, who went back to the original opening several times before trying something different, right? So there's lots of studies that show like little interesting problem solving in really young children for those who have had parts of their brain activated by multiple language systems, right? In adulthood, interestingly, this is one of the more interesting studies. Bilinguals have a 5+ year delay in the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So again, there's something going on in the brain, in the bilingual brain, right? Where you are doing brain exercise that monolingual folks just aren't doing, that develops these kind of cognitive skills and behaviors that even last into the long term. Despite this really compelling and important information, right, on brain science, Arizona doesn't have any policies to support these young kids in early learning. We're going to talk about the policies in K-12 in a second, which are a different story. But in early childhood, they're largely just absent, right? We don't collect data on these kids, on what languages they speak, on the richness of their, you know, bilingualism. We don't require childcare providers or anybody to have any sort of professional development on how to support bilingual development. We know that bilingual instruction and bilingual exposure is really important for these kids, but we don't do anything to encourage it, fund it, support it in any way. We also know in the K-12 system, Arizona is the last remaining state in the nation, embarrassingly, to have an English-only instruction law on the books in K-12 education. No other state has that. A few years ago, a national organization looked at policies to support young children who were bilinguals. And I'm not going to go through each of these policies, but I'll just draw your attention to Arizona's column, and it basically is all red with one green that has an asterisk next to it. So not great. When we think about the K-12 space, right, we talked about the baby brain research. There's also education research that finds that these kids who are English learners, right, who are not yet proficient by the time they enter kindergarten in English, we find that when you provide instruction, bilingual instruction, both in their home language, and you grow that, and in English, right, they actually become proficient in English more quickly, right? There's this counterintuitive and there's this narrative and this myth that like you just immerse them in English and they're just going to learn English really quickly, right? When that actually doesn't pan out. And what we see instead is that when we're giving bilingual instruction, they pick up English more quickly because they're able to make the bridges between their language and English. And when you strengthen, especially in Spanish, when you strengthen that Spanish home language base, it transfers, you have transferability to English. You have transferability in reading, in a lot of the letter sounds that are really similar, right, between those two alphabets. And so we find that there have been studies, for example, Portland Public School District has been running dual language programs for a couple decades now, and they've really rigorously tested it. And they found that English learners who are in the dual language programs compared to English learners who are in English-only programs perform better on math and English reading and reading of whatever the partner language is in 5th grade and 8th grade and then moving forward, right? We know these kids reach national academic norms faster, and then, of course, there's all the benefits of becoming biliterate in the workforce, especially in Arizona, with all of the commerce that goes on across the border. However, we know that this isn't really a reality for a lot of the kids in this state, right? And there have been studies that have looked at this issue. So we know that using national achievement data, one study found that the degree of segregation, right, where kids are physically learning, was the greatest predictor of disparities in achievement between these kids and their English-speaking peers, right? In Arizona, segregation of these kiddos has been the law of the land for a long time, right? Where we've had a structured English immersion law, where kids were required to spend a number of hours segregated away from their peers. Research says that's not good. Segregated settings is, of course, associated with less access to grade level content, right? If you are segregated over here learning English for 4 hours of your day, factor in lunch, factor in recess, factor in transitions, how much time is left for math and science and social studies and grade level content on anything else, right? Not much time. We also find that expectations with teachers are different across English only versus bilingual programs. And I always think this last bullet is really interesting. You know, we're a stubbornly monolingual nation, or we're trying to be through the policies that we put into place. But that's not the norm in countries around the world, right? It is common to go into schools in many, many, many other countries across many different continents, and where young children are learning 2 or 3 languages, like that's the norm, right? We are unique in that space. And in many of these societies, you see that the achievement gap between those kids who are native speakers of whatever the country's main language is and their peers is non-existent, or it's small. Still, knowing all of this, right, we have very little access to dual language education for our kids, right? Across the United States, only 8% of these kiddos are getting access to bilingual ed. That means that 92% are not, right? And we know this is especially pronounced in the state of Arizona, where we have this English only law in place and this proposition that's been in place for a long time and has recently, I guess in 2019, part of it was rolled back. But with the new state's, I guess he's not so new, superintendent for public instruction doubling down on English only instruction, that has not helped and has in fact even made us go back to previous pieces. So we don't have access. So what does that look like with our neighbors, right? We often think about issues that might be more politically palatable to Republicans or Democrats or whatever, but when we think about our regional neighbors, so think about Texas, you know, not the most liberal state in the world, right, or in the country. They passed the Bilingual Education Act in 1981 that required school districts to offer all ELs in preschool through 12th grade bilingual education if at least 20 children or more spoke the same home language. And so bilingual education for ELs in Texas has been the norm for decades, right? And you'll see right now what that outcome suggests. In Utah, in 2008, they passed legislation to offer incentives to schools and districts to implement dual language approaches in Utah. Again, not the most liberal state in the union that anyone would say by a long shot. If we think about the population, they have 119 dual language elementary schools compared to us, who have about 29, despite having 40% more students and many, 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 many more ELs in this state than that state, right? We've also seen like a number of other states, North Carolina, Delaware, California, others invest funding and pass budgets that actually prioritize expanding access to dual language education. It's a really fuzzy map, but it kind of looks at those regional neighbors, right? Not Florida necessarily, but Texas and Utah and Arizona. And it looks at our 4th grade reading scores, right? We are the dark gray box at the very bottom, right? And we see the other states, you know, well above in reading. There's been research done on this English only proposition, Prop 203. And what they found in this kind of long-term research they did was that by 3rd grade, ELs had made a little bit of gains, But then by 5th, 8th, and 10th grades, their outcomes had dramatically deteriorated, right? So this was not working. Only 15% of these kids were determined to be proficient in English after 1 year of this segregated structured English immersion program. We know that gaps between ELs and non-ELs math scores increased dramatically once this 4-hour block English, mandate was put in place. Not surprisingly, because as I said, where is there time for math in that school schedule? We know that in 2002, before this was fully implemented, ELs and non-ELs math performance in 8th grade differed by about 10 percentage points, right? By 2014, well after this was implemented, that had quadrupled to 40%. If we think about the graduation rates in our state, and we all know how important graduation rates are to the workforce, right, into the economy and to the labor market, we see that, for example, non-Latino white students graduation rate is about 85%, Latino students about 75%, Latino students who are English learners, 35%, right? We had the largest graduation gap in the entire nation between these two groups of kids, right? That has continued to widen. And we're only one of 6 other states in the country where fewer than half of all ELs are even graduating from high school on time. Not surprisingly, because who has time, right? Like there is no access to that grade level content. So that's a big issue, obviously. The last one, I'm just doing a time check, and I still have time, is harsh discipline. So I'll start with this slide here. Most folks have generally heard about expulsions and suspensions, are familiar with the concept in K-12 settings, right? Middle school, high school, kids get suspended or expelled for a number of different things. Back in 2014, the federal government started collecting data on expulsion and suspensions in preschoolers. So these are kids like just out of diapers, right? You probably wouldn't imagine that they're getting suspended and expelled, right? Like a middle schooler or a high school kid might. But what they found is that they were, and that it wasn't just all kids evenly, that it was young Black children in particular who were being suspended and expelled at starkly disproportionate rates that was mirroring the K-12 system. And so just last year, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine found that, again, reviewed all the research, and found that this harsh form of discipline starts early, that it's disproportionately applied to Black children, to boys, and to kids with disabilities, and that it's associated with negative short and long-term outcomes for kids and employment challenges for parents. Not surprisingly, again, imagine from the kid's perspective. Imagine you are 3 years old, right? And you have a meltdown and you're suspended from school. You come back 5 days later after your suspension's over, and now there's a rift there between you and your primary caregiver in the childcare setting, right? There's something in the relationship that's not going to be the same. Now the other kids are like, oh, this is the kid that gets in trouble. He's kind of being labeled. Now the kid might not feel as comfortable there, and is internalizing all this stuff. Maybe school isn't for me. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe they don't like me here, right? There's research that suggests that kids who have been suspended, it's not associated with better behavior. It's associated with more suspensions down the line, right? So it's not like it fixes anything or adjusts anything. So then now the kid enters kindergarten. Same kid is like kind of unsure if school's for him. It happens again, right? Now I come back and I actually missed 5 days of content, and we're learning how to read. And now I'm behind because I don't know the things that the other kids in the class had access to. So now I'm really starting to feel down on myself and wondering if school really isn't for me, and I'm only in kindergarten. Now imagine when that kid's in 3rd grade and then 8th grade, right? And the snowball effect that this can have over time. When you think about parents' employment, right? If your kid is your kid's school is continually asking you to pick your kid up early, or, suspending your kid, you have to leave work to go do that, right? Not all parents have flexible jobs, flexible schedules, flexible support systems. And so it deeply impacts parent employment, right? And now the family's stressed, and now the parents stressed, and now the parents mad, and it's just not a good situation. What we find, though, that's really important to note is that Black children don't behave worse than anybody else. They're just disciplined worse, right? So there has been no credible study, research, nothing documented. In fact, the opposite's been documented, that Black children behave worse. They don't. They just are. There has been lots of research that looks at different dimensions of what could be driving these disparities. One of them is the scrutiny. So Black children are watched more, right? There's expectations that they might behave bad. There's some researchers out of Yale who conducted this eye tracking research that asked early educators to watch a video of 4 children playing. And they said, when a kid's about to engage in a challenging behavior, hit the space bar. We want to see how good you are at predicting challenging behavior. And the video had a Black boy, a Black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And the teachers were going, and then they were tracking where they were looking, right? What they found was that when they hit the space bar, they were most likely, significantly more likely to be looking at the Black boy. And the catch was there was never any challenging behavior displayed on the video. There was never any hint of it. It was just 4 children playing. If you had never been asked anything about challenging behavior, you would have not known that that was even a problem. But there was a lot of space bars being hit looking at the Black boy, right? There's a bunch of research on scrutiny. There's a bunch of research on whose behavior we perceive as, okay, they're just having a bad day. Maybe they didn't sleep well. That wasn't that big a deal, versus, oh, that was really dangerous. And that is really problematic. And that is a bad kid, or that is a troublemaker, right? There's a research study out of Stanford that looked at this very thing, that looked, if you guys have seen those studies of resumes, where they look at racial bias in resumes, where they provide employers with the exact same resume, and they just have a different name and picture, right? A perceived white person, perceived Black person, and see who's more likely to get the call. So they did that, but in schools with child behavior records, where they had a Black child and a white child. Same behaviors were being exhibited. More likely to recommend removing the child if the child they thought was Black. More likely to label the child a troublemaker if the child was Black. And a number of other pieces. So anyway, all that to say, there's lots of research suggesting what's driving these pieces. None of them are that Black children behave worse, but there's lots of discipline structures in place that are really taking these children off of that positive trajectory and setting them up to fail as they go down the system. So federal civil rights data find that in Arizona, Black children are expelled from public preschool settings at more than 4 times the rate of their enrollment. Arizona has a childcare expulsion prevention program, but it doesn't prohibit suspensions or expulsions. It allows them, including for the youngest children. It just requires some steps to be taken and some trainings to be taken to try to prevent it. Even programs that are rated high in quality, based on the state's conception of quality, expelled children. So you could still be a 5-star, 4-star program, right, and be expelling children. So here's some of the data from the state that we found. There's a lot to see here. I think the biggest thing that I would draw your attention to is that, look at this orange bar indicating Black children. So this is their proportion all the way to the left of the overall young child population. And then these are all forms of expulsion. And you'll basically see that they're hugely overrepresented in every single form of suspension and expulsion from childcare. All right. I have a couple more sections and then we can open it up for questions, because I've been talking for a really long time. Now I want to talk a little bit about the early childhood workforce. So these are the providers who are actually doing the work that we've been talking about for the last hour, right? Obviously, without childcare providers, without early educators, we don't have access and we don't have quality. We don't have anything. But this is one of the most poorly treated workforces in the nation. In Arizona, this workforce has a median wage of $14.54 in 2021, which is a full-time salary of $30,000 and just above the federal poverty line for a family of 4. When I worked in the federal government, we did this analysis to look at the median income for childcare providers across all the states. I think in every state, they were eligible for food support SNAP benefits. So we think of what we're paying, like we're actually paying poverty wages, where they then have to tap other public resources to make ends meet because their salaries and their pay are not covering the basic cost to live. So it's nearly 2 times less than the average wage for all Arizona occupations when you combine. We also know that early childhood and childcare workers experience poverty rates at nearly 2 times that of the general Arizona workforce and 8 times higher than elementary school teachers. Sometimes that's just so wild to me because you are doing the same job. So you have, say you have a room of 4-year-olds and those 4-year-olds turn 5 and a month later they're in a different classroom with a kindergarten teacher. Well, the poverty rate is 8 times higher for that first classroom, for the teacher leading that first classroom than for the teacher teaching kids just a month older. And to be clear, Arizona is near the bottom in teacher pay for K-12 in general, right? This is not like race to the bottom, right? But considering we're near the bottom of teacher pay for K-12 and then thinking about the poverty rate all the way down for childcare providers, it's way less than even the K-12 educators. It presents a pattern of consistency in the state that kind of explains why we are where we are in a lot of places. Beyond the pay situation, we know that mental health is a big issue for childcare providers across the country, actually. And of course, part of it is associated with the poverty wages they make and all of the stressors that come with poverty. We see that the depression rate is nearly half. Nearly half of the early educators in the state are screening positive for depression. That is just higher than the national average, which is also astonishingly high. And that's important. Stress, similarly, about a third, right? That's important because stress and depression really impact your interactions with kids. Again, this is the brain building sensitive period where kids need positive input, responsive adults, caring adults, back and forth interactions, attention, appropriate supervision, all these things, right? Where depression and stress can really skew your ability to do that well. Especially, think about it as a parent. There's lots of research on parents who are experiencing depression and stress. Again, think about it as a provider who has to care for 5 little babies under age 1 or 8 little toddlers, right, under 3, 2-year-olds, and so on and so forth with these levels of mental health needs. The very last piece here is really zooming out, right? Because we've been talking about the early care and education and childcare systems in the state, and that is important. But even if we get that perfect and we have like fully accessible, fully high quality, well-paid providers, that would be inadequate, right? Because of course, families have a whole set of additional needs, right? And the supports for families are just not there in the state of Arizona, again, ranking really low compared to other states in the nation. So the Annie E. Casey Foundation publishes this report looking at child and family well-being in states, right? Across economic wellness, health, education, family and community factors, and then they rank the states, and then they kind of provide some example indicators there on the right. Long story short, right, like the education, early care and education, like the state of funding, the state of good policy, the state of responsive policy to kids is mirrored in these other systems as well. And it's kind of a pattern that we see. So the report has like a 15-page policy agenda with lots of details that I would, if you're interested, I would invite you to check out. But to sum it up in one little slide here, the first thing we recommend is you got to get quality right, because we could be throwing all this money and not that much money that we're throwing in, but if it's not quality, it's not what our kids deserve, and it's not what our families want, right? And it's not going to get us the outcomes and the ROI and the amazing brain development pieces if we are shortchanging the quality, right? And to get the quality right, we need to get the right floor, the right foundation, which is licensing, and get that up to code so that we're at least, right, operating at basic best standards. And we got to set the right North Star. And that right North Star has to include all the things we already talked about, right? It has to include bilingual learning opportunities, because we know that we are a richly linguistically diverse state, that the potential of that linguistic magic and diversity in this state is limitless, but that we are really just shortchanging ourselves, our economy, our futures, right, by being that stubbornly monolingual and refusing that access. We saw the graduation, right, high school graduation rates, and we saw the research, right? That North Star has to be aligned with research. That North Star has to include the needs of the kids who live here now, almost half of whom are dual language learners. It has to include kids with disabilities and including kids with disabilities. It has to attend to these inequities that we see in discipline for Black children in particular. It has to include all those different pieces. The second piece is access, right? It was quite pathetic, right? We saw one little program covers 1%. This program covers 4% of the kids. This Head Start, this federal program covers 20, which is a little better, but it's still only 1 in 5. Like this whole system of we're covering 1% here and there. The cities are trying to patch in 1% here and there. The access just is not where it needs to be, right? And it's fragmented, and it's not governed in the most efficient way because of these different pieces. And so we really need to get that under control. Equity, like this whole category, is what we were talking about just now, right? What is our attention to kids with disabilities? What is our attention to the Latinos in our state? What is the attention to the bilingual children in our state, which make up almost half of our state young child population? They have been just largely ignored in all of these resources and policies. And so how do we develop plans, collect data, invest resources, and implement these policies that really uplift these kids who have been historically marginalized or left behind? Governance, really, again, I already talked about the fragmentation, but aligning and having more efficient governance of these programs. And the last piece was the last slide that I ended with, right? Zooming out and investing in families as kids' most important teachers, caregivers, decision makers, et cetera, which includes their economic well-being, thinking about child tax credits, thinking about those different pieces, which includes their health, right? Thinking about kids' care, thinking about Medicaid, expansion, Medicaid policies to ensure that families are healthy and able to care for their kids and work. Thinking about family housing supports, right? We know we have a homelessness crisis in the state, and others. So really thinking about that whole picture. So with that, I think I'm done, and I will hand it back over to Frank. Are there any questions, or I guess we could open it up for questions. I didn't follow the chat. Oh, I don't think there were any in here.
Hi, Chantel. This is Kevin Burke with the City of Tucson. I've got a question for you. I'm curious if you could shed any light on what is or may be happening in this field in Maricopa County and amongst the Phoenix area municipalities.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That's a good question. And I don't know that I'm the best person to answer it, but because our report really looked at the state level and didn't do a lot of regional digging. I know that with some of the ARPA dollars, for example, the city of Phoenix, at least at that level, invested some of the dollars in Head Start, in the Head Start program. I know Maricopa County is a Head Start grantee, and has done a lot of great work in that space. I know some of the cities within the county has started their own pre-K programs. You're probably familiar. Tempe started their pre-K program. I think a number of other kind of municipalities within the within the county as well. I don't see like an awesome concerted effort at the county or even city level, right? I think we're all trying to patch holes where they exist and increase access by little bits here and there. But I think there's a long way to go. So would be happy to look more into it, but really a lot of our analysis was looking at the state level.
Yeah, that's helpful. Well, it's certainly where the problem primarily lies. So I appreciate the data and insight you provided here today.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
Hey, I don't have a question. But a comment. My name is Connie Espinosa, and I'm sit on the First Things First Regional Partnership Council for Pima South. I'm the educator representative, and I just wanted to say that I appreciate how you were explaining the issues. They were very clear and very concise, and the sad part is that there's so much more that we're dealing with, and so you know, those of you in the business community, we are always willing, our community is always willing to have a conversation and sit down and chat with you and talk to you about so much more of what we're facing in the day-to-day. It's you know, for a while, even though First Things First is such a small percentage of the system, a lot of times I used to say, well, you know, at least they're trying and at least they're doing, and our funding is declining so rapidly that we are also being faced with so many decisions to cut funding. And that's the unfortunate truth of even things that exist now, them being so tiny, are gonna in the next couple of years gonna all but go away. So we really need to lean on you guys, on our business community to help support early childhood.
Yeah, I don't know.
Kevin, I wanted to go back to your question about Maricopa County. So the one thing that Maricopa County did in the early childhood space is they are building like a Maricopa County employee child care facility where their employees will have access to child care. And that's within the county. They did increase their Head Start because the county is the Head Start grantee, as Shantel said. And they've also did a lot of space on the workforce side versus specifically in the child care side.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
If I could add as well, my name is Amy Morales-Baum. I'm the regional director for First Things First here in Pima North. And I just thank you, Shantel, for your presentation. I have seen much of this before, but I appreciate it. And I do want to say two things. One is we actually have a space for a business representative on our regional council right now. So if you are in the business sector and would like to represent the business sector on our regional council, please reach out to me. I'll put my email here. We would love to have a business voice. The now honorable Dan Huff was in the seat before this, but he became a court commissioner now, and so he can no longer serve in this capacity. But so we're looking for his replacement. Second, I'll say, as much as this report is very intense and there's a lot for us to grow from here, I think that there are some bright spots here happening in Pima County. I know many of you have heard of PEEPS. That is really truly a local collaborative of people who have decided that early childhood is important in our community, and amazing things are happening because of that, along with many other initiatives that have supported young children and families. So I think there are many ways that our business community can be involved in helping support decisions and funding that helps to really reverse a lot of what Dr. Meek was presenting about. And we do have opportunity for that to happen. So please reach out to myself or other early childhood advocates and agencies in town, and we would be happy to further discuss this with you so that we can make change in our community.
Yeah, I can add to your comment. Thank you, Dr. Meek, and thank you, Amy, for saying that, because I think it's definitely, and this obviously, hopefully somebody from the Tucson Metro could chime in. But I think one of the things that we could do is to really get all of this information that was presented and start getting in front of the business community, not just through to the chambers of commerce, but also to the other different organizations such as on Corridor. So Southern Arizona Leadership Council here in Tucson, Pima County, because supposed to be kind of the people helping out, driving some of the business policies, if you would, or let's say pro-business. But I think one of the things that we need to talk about is, okay, what is about pro-workers policies? And this is definitely one that has to be raised to the top because it affects businesses, right? No matter where you are, no matter where it's government, nonprofit, for-profit, public, private, doesn't really matter. That's what affects. So that's something that we definitely have to be more proactive and also intentional about really pushing this situation into the business sphere. So I work with Tucson Valley Credit Union, and definitely I will be one of the advocates to see what we can do with that. So you can reach me, Amy, to help. I'll be more than happy to as well.
Wonderful.
Thank you for the
Miguel.
information, doctor. That was very good. And maybe I'm biased because my wife is an ELL teacher for 30 years, so I know exactly a little bit what you just mentioned in there too, and that's definitely something that we need to change. So yeah.
Thank you, Miguel.
Gracias.
I would just, this is Nicole Scott from Pima County, and I would just also like to thank Dr. Meek for the presentation. The report is absolutely a little downing, right? But it opens eyes to folks that don't understand the work that we do in the industry every day. However, I do also have to say, I think the take-all message away from this is advocacy. Make sure it's on your legislative agendas. Make sure it's wide and present, because without us as one group, as one parent nation, reaching out to our legislators, to our Congress folks, to our governor, preaching this over and over and over again, we will not see that change. We just saw that a little bit in our last budget that was very sad for the industry. However, if we continue to have our voices loud and continue to advocate for our children and our youngest learners, I think that's the biggest message we can do, and the thing that's going to make those big changes occur to where that state report starts to look a little bit better.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if we know this state really listens to business. So having business at the table alongside, right, child advocates and workers and others, I think is a great point, Nicole. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. Oh, this is the, yeah, if you can get us to the, I don't know, we'll be able to get some of your slide deck, Dr. Meek, that would be great too, just to kind of, and I know somebody sent the report, right? That's from the.
Yeah, I'm happy to share my slides. We could send it after the call.
Equity. Okay. All right.
Any other questions? All right.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Meek. It was really incredible. I went several months ago at this point, but great information. I'm reading all the comments. So very cool. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right. Buen día.
All right.
Bye-bye.